I recommend that you watch both Part 1 and 2 of this series if you haven't already. But to quickly recap, in Part 1 I explained how it's well within the realm of possibility to win a majority of the delegates in the Democratic primaries in order to win the nomination outright in the first round at the Democratic Convention, without getting particularly close to winning a majority of the popular vote in the primary outright. I did this by illustrating the fact that it's mathematically possible to win the Democratic primaries with around 10% of the popular vote, with the second place candidate winning approximately 55% of the popular vote. An extreme, but usefully descriptive scenario. In Part 2, I showed that it's relatively difficult for the Democratic Party establishment to slow down a runaway insurgent candidate simply by getting other candidates to drop out of the race in order to coalesce around whoever they think is the ideal choice to beat the insurgent. I used the example of a simplified New Hampshire primary to illustrate that. Now this video, Part 3, explains how doing well on a district-by-district level is more important than simply running up the popular vote count on the state level.
I'll be honest in saying that this sort of thing is incredibly hard to plan for. How does one exactly make sure you focus resources on overperforming on a district level rather than simply doing well in the state? How do you have such precise targeting? More on that later. But at the very least, understanding this can help explain why a candidate can do as well or poorly as they did with their delegate count, given their popular vote, even if you might not be able to plan ahead for it. Anyway, to continue, the reason for this is similar to the logic that produced a national primary victory with less than 10% of the national popular vote. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to create an extreme scenario, as was done with the first cases, occurring in an imaginary state that has 4 congressional districts, each with 10 delegates each, adding up to a total of 40 district delegates, which would mean 20 statewide district delegates, and therefore a combined total of 60 delegates. Note, in the upcoming scenario, all 5 candidates are getting 20% of the statewide popular vote, so they all get 4 statewide delegates, meaning that all differences come down to the district breakdown. So, what does the scenario look like? In District 1, candidate A has 14% of the vote and therefore gets no delegates. Candidate B gets 20% of the vote and therefore gets 3 delegates. Candidate C has 25% of the vote and therefore gets 3 delegates. Candidate D has 30% of the vote and therefore gets 4 delegates. Candidate E has 11% of the vote and therefore gets no delegates. In District 2, Candidate A has 14% of the vote and therefore gets no delegates. Candidate B has 20% of the votes and therefore gets 2 delegates. Candidate C has 24% of the vote and therefore gets 3 delegates. Candidate D has 25% of the vote and therefore gets 3 delegates. Candidate E has 17% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. In District 3, Candidate A has 14% of the vote and therefore gets no delegates. Candidate B has 20% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. Candidate C has 15% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. Candidate D has 16% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. Candidate E has 35% of the vote and therefore gets 4 delegates. In District 4, Candidate A has 38% of the vote and therefore gets 4 delegates. Candidate B has 20% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. Candidate C has 16% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. Candidate D has 9% of the vote and therefore gets no delegates. Candidate E has 17% of the vote and therefore gets 2 delegates. Final delegate count is Candidate A,
8 delegates.
Candidate B, 13 delegates. Candidate C, 14 delegates. Candidate D, 13 delegates. Candidate E, 12 delegates. As you can see here, despite all candidates sharing the same statewide total, the thresholds at the district level intervene such that despite both candidate A and C having the same statewide popular vote, candidate C has nearly twice as many delegates as candidate A. Meanwhile, despite candidate B being above threshold everywhere and candidate D being below threshold in District 4, ended up with the same amount. Rather than going deep into the math, I'll summarize how each candidate did with language. Candidate A failed to reach threshold everywhere except District 4, costing them delegates that they couldn't make up for by winning big in District 4. Candidate B reached threshold everywhere, but failed to exploit the high rate of below-threshold candidates in District 1, giving them a solid total, but not the best of all 5 candidates. Candidate C overperformed its statewide total in both District 1 and 2 while reaching threshold in 3 and 4. Candidate D failed to reach threshold in District 4, but since they overperformed in District 1, the district in which only 3 candidates were above the threshold, it was able to reach the same level as Candidate B, who met threshold everywhere. Candidate E missed a threshold in the district that 2 other candidates overperformed in, meaning that overperforming in District 3, in much the same way candidate did in District 4, was not enough. The most important results here, however, can be found with candidates A, C, and D. Candidate A is an excellent illustration of what happens when your support base is not spread around geographically. Candidate C is an illustration of the fact that you can win the popular vote absolutely nowhere, but as long as you meet the threshold everywhere and overperform your average in places where few hit the threshold, you can end up coming away with more delegates than anyone else. Candidate D is an illustration of the power of overperforming in places where few hit threshold, to the point it can make up for being one of the few to miss threshold in an entire district. The most important lesson we can draw from this is that when you're going into a state, you want to A. hit threshold everywhere, B. overperform in districts where few hit threshold. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. In reality, all candidates will have different statewide numbers. Not all districts have the same delegate count, and candidates dropping out of the race will drastically affect the popular vote count and the delegate breakdown. However, those variances, those uncertainties, as talked about earlier in this video, only increase the window through which it is possible for an insurgent candidate, should they have the right organization and momentum, make their way through to a majority before even reaching the convention, securing it from plotting and superdelegate votes that might occur if they don't hit a majority. So, how does one exactly apply the information brought to light through this scenario, such that it can be an active tool for planning, rather than simply an explanation after the fact for why a candidate won as many delegates as they did, given their vote total? Well, the simple answer is having a very large army of campaign staff and volunteers. Doing stuff like micro-targeting online ads, for example, can help target your efforts with precision, but nothing as of yet exists that can replace the information that can be gathered by a large force of volunteers knocking on doors or getting out the vote. Any mathematical planning is only as good as the data points that can be created and verified. It also helps that having a large force of volunteers helps win elections on the basis of sheer numbers anyway. It is completely within the power of an insurgent campaign to win the Democratic primaries without the establishment having the ability to take it away, even if it can't win close to a majority of the votes right out of the gates. Funnily enough, though, is that when that ball starts rolling, the bandwagon effect and other candidates dropping out late in the primaries ends up turning what was once not a majority into one. At the end of the day, what is most required is effective organization and a motivated, committed movement to make it work. Given that, a victory can be won without it being taken away at the convention on a second round of votes or by superdelegates.
So that's the third and final part of this series. Now, over the weekend, I'll be releasing a video about one particular person I think should not be the vice presidential nominee should Bernie Sanders successfully win the Democratic nomination. To provide 2 hints regarding that video, hint 1, while I don't think she'd make a good vice presidential pick, the topic of the video is not Elizabeth Warren. Hint 2, I'll be spending a significant amount of time talking about foreign policy, particularly in regards to how it must be shaped by the implementation of a Green New Deal. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell to be notified of future videos.